You have to be in, stop the recording.
Just say.
Okay. You know, I think people are kind of trickling in, but I had just a few words to say, so I will start. I'd like to welcome my friend Fran, neighbor and hiking buddy, partner in mischief, so who joined us tonight from Woodside Park. As you know, Karen's going to be our host tonight, and she's going to talk about her lifelong engagement in the quest to preserve and advance abortion rights and women's reproductive health. So, you know, this is so far, you know, a very manageable sized group, but if you have a question, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can put questions in the chat or comments. And if there are questions, I'll try and consolidate those and make sure that everybody's questions and opinions get heard, or that you just have a chance to chime in. So when Karen starts talking, I'd like to ask you just to mute your speakers, just, you know, because phones ring and background noise happens, and we all know what that's like. So Karen, would you like to take it from here?
I would, thank you. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about my own background in reproductive rights, and then talk about sort of the state of play with regard to access to abortion. Then I'm going to turn to a little bit about abortion in the Jewish context, and then sort of talk about like what's about to happen, what's on the horizon, and then finish with ways that if you want to get involved, I'd be happy to share some ideas with you, and then we can open it up, as Cheryl said, for discussion. So I was 17 when Justice Blackmun wrote the decision in the Roe v. Wade case that legalized abortion in every state in the country. I will not forget that day. It was January 22nd, 1973. And I was standing in the little kitchenette of our apartment in Manhattan. And my mom and I heard the news on the radio, and we just embraced each other for the longest time. My mom, who I don't believe ever had an abortion herself, illegal or legal, and whose choices in life were circumscribed by sort of medieval patriarchal attitudes about women at the time, she knew instinctively, I think, that this decision would have a profound effect on me and all my friends, that we could make our own decisions about when and whether to have a kid. And she knew that I would never be captive to an unplanned pregnancy like so many women were before me. It's true that in New York State, where I obviously lived, being a Manhattanite, they had legalized abortion in the 1970s. So if I had needed one, I could have had an abortion legally. But, you know, my mom figured, who knows where Karen would live when she's grown up, and when, you know, where I'd be if I ever needed an abortion. It turns out I never actually had one. 25% of women in America today have had or will have an abortion. But I was really, really glad that I knew that I would have that choice if I ever needed and wanted to end a pregnancy. So, you know, the ruling came in the midst, of course, it was 1973. It was the modern women's movement, the second wave, as it's called today. And the abortion ruling was really nothing short of revolutionary. It meant, you know, that a woman could go and have a job, and if she got pregnant, she could take care of the pregnancy, or she could stay pregnant, but, you know, and that she could really decide to marry for the right reasons, not because she had gotten impregnated by a guy. At the time, 1973, like I said, I was 17, but in the years leading up to it, I was a little budding feminist. I had a mentor, a history teacher, who kind of plucked me out of the classroom, and she would bring me along to her consciousness raising groups. I don't know, have any of you heard of those things? Raise your hand if you have. Okay. So I would like sit, I was this like 14-year-old girl, and I would like sit, and all these grown women would kvetch about their horrible marriages and the domestic prison that they lived in. And I'm like, oh my God, this is like incredible. What am I doing here? And I just kept my mouth shut, but it really had profound, impact on me. And they also talked about pregnancy and reproductive health. So for this talk, I dug out one of my earliest feminist tracts. Many of you will be familiar with Our Bodies, Ourselves. Now it's like a really thick thing. Well, this was like a 1970 printing. It sold for 40 cents. And as you can see, it's yellowed, and I have saved it, very thin. But just to, here are my feminist bona fides from when I was a kid. So going back to
Can you hold it up again?
Oh yeah, sure.
I just had this conversation with my daughter about Our Bodies, Ourselves. And
Oh wow.
I was saying how I didn't save I didn't have that 40 cent, but my original, and I gave her, a much later version, but that is the coolest thing ever. Okay.
Thank you. So Justice Harry Blackmun was this Midwestern, very reserved, homespun kind of guy, but he became my hero basically, as were all the women who came before me who fought so that I could have, equal rights. And, and then all the women who died on, back alley abortions for many years. So after college, I moved to LA to try to become a journalist, but I ended up not quite yet succeeding at that. And I went to work at something called the Feminist Women's Health Center, which still exists. There are a few of them in LA and Atlanta and so forth. And what my job was, in part, was to go around with a speculum, which all the women on this call know what that is. And I would get up on a table and show women how to do self-examination, so that with a mirror, and, for the first time, like, women actually saw what their cervix looked like. And it was a pretty revolutionary thing to do. The other thing was that the founders of the Feminist Women's Health Center did not believe that Roe would necessarily remain the law of the land, how prescient they were. And so we did something that some of you may be appalled at, but they developed this self-abortion technique. It was called menstrual extraction. I did not use it or demonstrate it, but some other people did. It was like a little mini suction thing. And it was to have if Roe ever was taken away. The health center also performed abortions, and part of my job sometimes was assisting the OBGYN who was performing the abortion. And so my job was to stand next to the top of the woman, sort of by her head and shoulders, and comfort her and hold her hand and tell her what was happening. And then at the end of the procedure, my job, I'm sure it's more modern today, but my job was to take the suction tube and literally, we called it crimping it, like squeeze it together once the abortion was complete, to stop the suction, and then it was all over. So that was my hands-on experience with the provision of abortion services. And then I moved back east. I did become a full-time journalist and began my adulthood in earnest. And so by the early 90s, I was reporting in Washington, and I don't know if you remember, but there were a bunch of pro-choice demonstrations, really big ones with hundreds of thousands of people marching in the street. And I was there covering it for Night Raider newspapers, but I did not want to be writing about everyone else who was marching in this. I wanted to be marching in the protest too, and I couldn't as a journalist. So, and then the whole Anita Hill thing was happening around that time. So I decided I would change careers. I would stop being a journalist. And because I knew the heads of NARAL and Planned Parenthood from my reporting, I was lucky enough to get a job as Director of Communications at the National Abortion Rights Action League. And that was quite a demanding job. It was very high pressure. It was also a scary time because I don't know if you recall, but in the mid-90s was when a few abortion provider doctors were shot and a couple were killed. So we had bulletproof glass and the whole 9 yards. And then the whole partial birth abortion thing, which I won't even go into, but that became controversial. And for my own sanity, I needed to move on to another organization, although eventually I ended up at another women's rights organization. I worked on the abortion issue. And even in my human rights work, I worked on the right to choose. So over the years, I watched and sometimes fought against the passage of hundreds, and by now there are thousands of state restrictions on abortion. I want to show you a map that shows where anti-choice restrictions were introduced last year. I think hopefully Rena is going, there you go. No, not that one. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes, it is that one. I apologize. So I think this was from 2021, and as you can see, there were 600 pieces of legislation introduced in 47 states. And of course, you can see that even in blue states, there are restrictions. There are only really 3 states, California. I don't know why Nebraska, maybe they've just passed everything. And same with Georgia. Those were the only states. So for years, hundreds and hundreds of these provisions were introduced and passed in many states. And then what started to happen was there were court cases that came along, and the Supreme Court began to chip away at the right to choose. So in 1989, and the court cases are important because will eventually come up to what's happening in today's high court. So in 1989, there was a case called Webster versus Reproductive Health Services. And in that decision, the Supreme Court allowed Missouri to prohibit the use of public funds. It said no money, no employees or facilities that get state funding can be used for abortion. That was kosher with the Supreme Court. And then in 1992, an even bigger deal case came along, and that was the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case. It was a Pennsylvania case. Casey was the governor of Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, who was anti-choice, although a Democrat. So what the court did in that case was it upheld Roe, but it altered Roe's trimester framework and replaced what had been like what they called, I don't know if there are any lawyers on the call. Rena, you can put the Zoom squares back on, thank you. There had been this strict scrutiny standard that the court had used to evaluate a restriction. But what Casey did was it changed it to what it called, and I believe it was Sandra Day O'Connor who wrote the decision. It might have been Kennedy, but I think it was O'Connor, with the undue burden standard. And that said that restrictions would be unconstitutional if they were enacted solely for the purpose of putting restrictions, making it more difficult for a woman to get an abortion. But they said things like mandatory waiting periods, parental consent, and other restrictions, but those were the two big ones, were okay. And what's terrible about a mandatory waiting period is this really affects low-income women because it requires you to have multiple visits. First, you have to go, you have to have your appointment, then you have to wait 24, 48, 72 hours, then you have to go back, then you have to go back again for the abortion. And, you know, imagine if you're a low-wage worker, you might not be able to afford to take 3 days off. What about childcare those days if you're a mom? So, and then the parental consent restriction was also terrible. It sounds benign on the surface, like what parent doesn't want to be involved in her daughter's decision around that? But imagine if you were in an abusive home or you were going to get kicked out of the home if your parents knew. So that really ended up causing a lot of young girls to not get the abortion or self-abort. And there was one famous case of a girl named Becky Bell who died from a self-abortion. She was like 15 or 16. So the thing that I was saying about the mandatory waiting periods and the economic impact, it's why today people who work in the abortion rights movement actually talk about it more as reproductive justice, because reproductive justice encompasses all the stuff, all the economic issues and other social issues that come into play with a woman's decision around choosing an abortion. So fast forward to today, the situation is far more dire. The case before the court that was argued in December is called Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. And what that case is Mississippi appealed to the Supreme Court a lower court ruling that said Mississippi's ban on abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy was unconstitutional. It was pretty clear from the oral arguments that the now conservative majority on the court is going to likely uphold that law. The question is, will they go beyond upholding that law and strike down Roe altogether? So no one knows, of course, what's going to happen. But if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned this June, they'll probably decide the case at the very end of June when they do their controversial cases by right before the term ends. 17 states have what are called trigger laws, which would automatically ban abortion if the court allowed. If the court overturned Roe. There's states like Alabama, Arkansas, Idaho, Oklahoma, West Virginia, even Wisconsin, which surprised me, Texas, Utah, a lot of the expected ones. So there's 17 that have trigger laws, and then there's another 11 that may pass bans. So you will have pretty quickly more than half the states where abortion will become absolutely illegal again. And Rena, if you could put up the Guttmacher map. There's Guttmacher is a pro-choice research organization, and they track all of these restrictions and laws. And thank you. This is a map that shows, okay, so the orange states, can you just scroll up a little bit? Yeah. The orange states are what they call the ban states. That means it will become illegal. The green states are the nearest clinic states. So that means if you're a woman in Montana, you would have to drive across Montana down to through Wyoming and into Colorado, or maybe across over to Oregon or Washington State. The gray states up in the Northeast are states where it would not be banned, but would not be very close to one of the orange states. So it's the blue or the teal states that are expected to get a lot of an influx of people from the banned states. And as you can imagine, again, like having to drive 3 states over to access basic health care is an obscenity, in my opinion. So if the court does not overturn Roe in this Mississippi case, there are other cases winding their way through the court. The most egregious one, of course, is Texas, which has banned abortions after 6 weeks. Most women don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. According to the Guttmacher Institute, there are 9 states in total that have passed these bills, but only in Texas, only the Texas one is in effect. And as you know, it's like a vigilante thing where a person can charge another, the Uber driver who drove you to an abortion. Okay, so that's the dire situation. So now, because this is an Adat Shalom talk, I was asked to talk about Jews and abortion. And I want to caveat this by saying, I am not an expert, but I did some research. So here's what I understand. Most American Jews strongly support abortion. There was a 2017 Pew Research survey that Rena is going to put up, thank you, Rena, that found that 83% of American Jews, more than any other religious group except Unitarians, they're 90%, then the atheists, the agnostics, and then the Jews, and then the Buddhists, and then the Episcopals, and then the Congregationalists. But the question that they were responding to, by the way, was that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. The thing is that Judaism's view on abortion is somewhat nuanced. The Torah doesn't address the issue directly. The principal biblical source for Jewish law on abortion is a passage in Exodus concerning a case in which 2 men are fighting and injure a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry. The verse says that if no other harm is done, the person who caused the damage must pay compensatory damages, sort of treating the fetus as the property of the woman. But if there's further harm to the woman, then he would pay with his life. Elsewhere, the Mishnah says that if a pregnant woman is sentenced to death, the execution can go forward, provided she has not yet gone into labor, a further indication that Jewish law does not accord the fetus full human rights prior to birth. Jewish law does not share the belief among abortion opponents that life begins at conception, obviously, nor does it legally consider the fetus to be a full person until birth. I think I'll skip over some of this. Feticide, though, is prohibited by Jewish law. You know, along with like suicide and wounding oneself, feticide is sort of put in that category. But as a public policy matter, most of the major, American Jewish denominations and organizations have been really vocal in supporting the right to choose. Obviously, the Orthodox don't. But even the Orthodox say that laws banning abortion when the mother's life is at risk run afoul of Jewish teaching. So there is that. Okay, so what's next for the abortion rights movement, assuming that the court either eviscerates Roe, completely overturns it, or severely curtails it? So there will be a lot of efforts like that of the Jane Collective, which was a group of ordinary women, teachers, homemakers, nurses, whoever in Chicago, that basically facilitated abortions from 1969 to 1972 or 73 when the ruling came down. In 72, the Chicago police raided an apartment used by the Janes, and there's movies coming out about this. 7 women were arrested, and in the police van, the women took the index cards that had the names and phone numbers of the women who had used their abortion services. They ripped the names and addresses off and stuffed and swallowed the paper on the way to the police station to protect the women. Obviously, abortion rights groups are, amassing a war chest. They're recruiting volunteers to help people travel across those multiple states. They're developing a market to deliver the abortion pill, which, really is an amazing development, straight to patients' doorsteps, so that even, I don't know how they're doing it, but even in states that have banned the abortion pill or the sale of the abortion pill, somehow they're going to figure out a way to try to get the pill to women. I think clinics in the good states are staffing up because they're anticipating, an influx of new patients from other states. So obviously if Roe is not overturned, if they just uphold the law, allow more restrictions to go, the conservative groups, the anti-choice groups are going to go crazy, and they're going to try to pass, 1 billion new bans until one of them goes up through the court and the court overturns Roe altogether. So the last thing I would just want to touch on before we open it up for a conversation is kind of how you might, if you're outraged and would like to do something, what you can do. Obviously, you can contribute. My personal point of view, is that big groups like Planned Parenthood are very well resourced. Smaller organizations are less so. And there are reproductive rights groups that center low-income women. Well, Planned Parenthood clinics, of course, serve low-income women. So I'm not saying anything negative at all about PPFA, but there are groups like Sister Song and Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity are really centering women of color, and women of color, low-income women, are the ones who are going to feel the effects of the bans, right? We won't in Maryland, it's a good state. Even if it were a bad state, we could afford to take our daughters to another state. It's the poor folks who get screwed. I'll tell you one more thing. I have been a donor to an organization called the National Network of Abortion Funds, and it is exactly what it says. There are these state or city abortion funds, and I'll tell you about 2 in Maryland in a sec. And what they do is they provide small grants to women who need the financial help to get their abortion. So I've donated, but now I'm starting to volunteer. I just did my first call last night, actually. You get trained, you make your first calls with a trainer listening and watching you. But basically, the group I'm working with locally is called the DC Abortion Fund, known as DCAF. There's also the Baltimore Abortion Fund. And essentially, you call, you tell them what how far along you are, when and where your abortion appointment is, how much it's going to cost, whether you can put any money towards it. So a typical first trimester abortion might be $300 or $400, a second trimester abortion, $600 and up. Third trimester abortion is many thousands of dollars. That's a whole different ballgame. So DCAF will give $200 for a first trimester abortion. And then we tell them to call the Baltimore Fund. They'll give $100, and maybe the woman can chip in a little bit. And then there are other resources that we direct women to. And I think it's going to be a really rewarding experience for me personally to actually help women who need the help. So if you're interested, I can put in some information in the chat. So thank you for listening. And please unmute yourselves. Let me know if you have questions, if you have thoughts about what's going on today, what your own experiences have been, etc. Ingrid. Cheryl, you're my mom. Sorry.
I'm wondering why you think, why you think small. I don't know how to ask this without sounding like I'm being argumentative, and I'm not. I just wonder why you think the smaller organizations are so important, and I need more explanation about that.
Because I think big organizations, and again, give to Planned Parenthood if you want to, like, please. It's just my personal point of view. But big organizations like Planned Parenthood or NARAL will take your dollars and use it for a variety of things, right? They'll use it for advocacy. They'll use it for political work. And maybe that's what you want your dollars to go to. It can be used in a variety of ways. Whereas if you want to focus your giving, and again, it's a totally personal choice, but if you want to focus your giving on the women who need it most, and maybe that's where I'm at, because I've spent a lot of years professionally working in advocacy organizations. So I've sort of, including NARAL, I've kind of been there, I've done that, and they're great and they're needed. But for me personally, I just feel like it's the women, the ones who are getting screwed the most are the ones who need our help the most. And that's why I recommend organizations that focus on those particular women who are most disadvantaged by the political climate. But again,
so
whatever you want.
So you're saying that NARAL does mostly advocacy and they don't do any hands-on? They don't
NARAL,
work?
No, they don't. NARAL does not. NARAL does advocacy, they do political work, they have a PAC, they donate to candidates, and maybe that's what like moves you, is the political stuff. So give to NARAL. Planned Parenthood the same. Planned Parenthood, of course, has clinics.
They have clinics, so they're helping people. Do
Right.
they, when you go to one of their clinics, do you have to pay them?
Just if you're seeking an abortion or birth control, yes.
Okay.
And that's what this organization, the DC Abortion Fund, will do, is it will, if you have an appointment at Planned Parenthood clinic, we will provide the funding so that you can, and Planned Parenthood provides like $100 from their justice fund for low-income women to have an abortion. So they do help.
I don't know if it's still true, but in the olden days, Planned Parenthood did have a sliding fee scale, and they may still. I haven't kept up with that.
Yeah.
And they also, I believe, were taking insurance, including Medicaid. But I'm not certain that that's true anymore.
I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure you can't get a Medicaid abortion. I think that's what the Hyde Amendment is.
Yeah.
But yes, I think you're right, Fran, about the sliding scale. I'm sure that's true today.
I mean, it could be that some states use state funds to pay for abortions. I know California has done that. I worked at a family planning clinic in the 70s and 80s in San Francisco. And we were able to cover, have Medicaid, but I know that the federal fund pulled out.
Right.
But not very states, but I think there are some states that will use state funds to.
Yeah.
There are 16,
Oh, there you go. That's good.
but in the rest of them, no, because you can't use Medicare because of the
Medicaid, yeah.
Medicaid.
Yeah. Camilla?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I just I was just responding to the discussion about Planned Parenthood. And with Planned Parenthood, I have done some donating. And for example, I was advised to give to the clinics rather than give to the national organization is the one that does the advocacy. So if you want to give more to and actually to the DC clinic, they gave me a whole list of how many abortions, that was able to help fund and, what they had done over that year. So I just wanted to explain that to everybody who was interested.
Yeah, I think it's called Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan Washington. And you could probably, their fund for low-income women is called the Justice Fund. So I guess you could probably ask and see if you could earmark your money for that fund.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, Karen, can you re-educate me about the abortion pill? How long after, how long after the sexual act are you permitted to take it, or will it? I can't remember. I don't remember the stuff, and I'm curious because, like for instance, in Texas, can those pills be smuggled in to women without? I mean, it seems to me that there's an underground way of getting abortions with that, and is there an ongoing effort to do that right now?
So I think there's two kind of pills. One is the morning after pill, and that you have to take within 24, 48 hours. Don't quote me on that because I haven't studied up on it. But the problem with the morning after, so that prevents the fertilization, basically. So it's not an abortion, it's a form of birth control. But the problem with that is that in conservative states, certain drugstore chains have said they're not going to prescribe it. And so there is a push to get it to become an over-the-counter medication, but I don't know if this FDA will do it or not. The abortion pill used to be called, maybe still is, RU486. and it's a combination of 2 drugs, mifepristone and misoprostol, or I'm mangling it, but something like that. And that can be, that is an abortifacient or abortifacient, I guess. And that is the pill that abortion rights folks are working or figuring out now. How can they get those pills like smuggled into this bad states, so that women, and it's a wonderful thing because, I mean, you don't have to go to a clinic and you can do a telemedicine health appointment. And although some states are banning those for the purposes of abortion services, but so I don't know what they're going to do to get those pills into women in the bad states, but they're plans.
Karen?
I don't know, Cheryl, do you want to go and I'll wait, or?
My question's kind of
sorry.
quick. I was just wondering whatever happened to the extraction devices. Do those still exist?
I don't think so. I think they've been supplanted by things like the morning after pill and the abortion pill, which is probably a safer way. Now, I don't know for sure. Maybe they're still in use somewhere. I can picture them now. They were a small little canister with a tube, but I don't think they're in use. That's my best guess.
I read that Adrian Jones from, I think, the state of Maryland Senate wants to have abortion rights be a constitutional right in the state of Maryland. So I don't know if that is going to be successful. I don't know politically where there's at and what that would mean, because on that map, it made it look like the state of Maryland, there weren't a lot of abortion clinics available. It was a gray state, but maybe I interpreted that incorrectly. So it's kind of a combination of 2 questions there, Karen.
Yeah, it's a gray state. It's legal in abortion, but it's just a gray state because it's not that adjacent to the bad states. You have to travel over a couple. But believe it or not, I believe there are 2 clinics left in the United States of America where you can get a late-term abortion, and one of them is in Montgomery County. Yeah, so we're doing pretty well.
Is that the one in Germantown?
I don't know where it's located. I actually thought it was Bethesda, but I could be wrong.
But this constitutional right to have an abortion, so that means even if Roe versus Wade is overturned in Maryland.
Right. What overturning Roe v. Wade means that it would go back to the states, most likely, because that's the way it was before Roe, and each state can decide for itself. And I think there are a few states that have it enshrined in their constitution. It would be great if Maryland did.
I mean, it seems like over the last 20 years, even though we have Roe and abortion's legal, in many states, it was kind of, a false promise, because there were maybe 1 clinic, maybe 2
Right.
clinics in the whole state, or maybe none. And so women have been having to travel to get abortions for a while now, even though it's legal. So I guess my question is, there must be organizations that have popped up in these places where access has been so bad. And I think those places need support, probably. And whether you know how to find out, like in Missouri or Montana or these places, like who are the people who have been helping women get access?
Right. Well, I know the names of a few of them, but I'm not even sure I know what states they're in. But there are, and in some states, there's nothing. Like Mississippi has 1 abortion clinic in the entire state. But some of the organizations that I mentioned are based in the South, like Sister Song is somewhere in the South. There's something called Access Reproductive Care Southeast. Anyway, but somewhere out there, there have to be a list of those kinds of organizations that people can get involved with.
Don't some of these laws make it illegal to provide this kind of assistance? You know, the reporting, I forget what that's called, the vigilante aspects of these, I think.
Yeah, that's in Texas. That's the Texas law has that vigilante piece. And I seem to recall reading that some of the abortion clinics in Texas had, because they were not busy providing abortions, had gotten very busy with helping women with logistics to get to, I think, Oklahoma, and fundraising to help provide support for plane fare and so on.
Yeah, I think that is right, that raising money to help people travel, because you have to fly or drive or take a bus, and then you need a hotel. You know, there's all of the ancillary stuff that I think is becoming a bigger part of the provision of abortion services to low-income women as the number of states that offer it shrink a lot.
So I just typed in for the National Network of Abortion Funds, and actually they have a state by state list of all the funds. You know, so I mean, it's actually interesting because you look at Alabama and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 funds that are helping in Alabama, and it looks like some of them are. One is that Access Reproductive Care Southeast that you mentioned, but like there's one called Indigenous Women Rising and the Bridget Alliance. And so it is, you know, I just learned about these the other day when Maddie Levin was fundraising through a Facebook fundraiser for this, but it does seem like several of these funds also now operate in multiple states.
They do. And like the DC Abortion Fund, the one that I'm getting involved with, they have what they call they have different lines that where women call and it gets funneled to the Maryland line, the Virginia line, or the DC line. But then they have a solidarity line. And that apparently is growing in prominence, not prominence, but importance, because that's where women are coming from out of state. So maybe a woman lives in Mississippi and she has a cousin in DC and maybe could stay with the cousin, but needs the transportation to get to DC and needs the childcare. And so that's a whole, so yes, so I think the out of state traveling band of women for basic health care is becoming a really big deal these days.
Karen, yeah, I'm gonna put my hand down, I guess. I know that many of us start conversations like this, but there was a very powerful story on NPR this morning just about this issue of traveling. And there were several doctors speaking from nearby states around Texas that said they are already log jammed.
Yeah.
They already have more clients than they can manage, more travel, that women are being tasked to wait extended times and then they are not able to go. And then I think the part that was most poignant was the psychological issue. One of the doctors had been at an abortion clinic for several years in Hawaii, where the culture is much more accepting of this as a means of women's welfare. And she said that people that in all of her years working there as an abortion doctor, she only would guess about 10% complained of pain and needed more than ibuprofen. But
Mhm.
now, because of the stress associated with women from Texas going to where she is posted, she is saying now that has flipped, and 90% are dealing with extraordinary pain that she perceives as brought on by the stress of being under the radar and trying to do this and trying to amass money and trying to do it on dates and all of those things. And her prediction is, if this was happening in Texas now, what will happen after June across the country?
Right. I know.
If I can find that story, I know what time when I was in the car, I'll at least send the link to Karen.
That's great.
It
Yeah.
just was disturbing.
It's really mind-boggling. I mean, this is basic healthcare. It is a safe procedure. And all of these obstacles are just making women have later abortions because they have to jump through all the hoops, or it's making them not have the abortion and have an unwanted pregnancy, carry it to term, and all the implications of that. I mean, this is fundamental health care. It is something that women have done, you know, for eternity, and it needs to be safe and legal. And I really hope that, like, women take to this, and men, people take to the streets again and make some changes, because it's an absolute outrage.
So, Karen, that was actually a question I had. I mean, I've really been mixed because we've been marching our whole adult life, and this is where we are. But does anybody on this call know of any plans for people to turn out and force? I haven't heard anything.
I don't.
I heard something about one march, but it didn't seem very well coordinated. I mean, that's the kind of things that the really big advocacy groups should put together, right?
Yeah, I'm surprised we haven't heard of anything.
Yeah.
Maybe something is being planned for the spring when the court, when the high court rules, but I don't know. I mean, remember the massive women's march, like after Trump was elected? That's what people should be doing now, because it is. And anyway, elections matter, because this is where we are today because of Trump.
Well, Karen, I think, we promised everybody we'd wrap up by 8:30, but I just want to thank you. This has been stimulating and just really a pleasure to hear from you. And if I hear about a march going on, I'll spread the word. We should all do that.
Please do. Yeah. Thank you all for your interest and your thoughts and questions. It was fun. Now I'll see you on the streets.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
You too.
Karen,